So let me quickly do an introduction to the attendees that are listening in from all parts of Africa and across the world. Yeah, and this is Senator Jane Cordy, and she's the senator for Canada. I think you're for Nova Scotia, right?
Yeah, it's in for the Canadian government, but I represent Nova Scotia. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. We have taught this much. Okay. So anyways, Senator Carly has a special address for us here in Africa, and she's from Canada, and she wants to talk from the political perspective on how to, encourage, sickle cell system here in Africa. So you can go ahead, Senator Carly, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for the introduction and for. And I really want to thank the organizers of the Second African Congress on Sickle Cell Disease for inviting me to speak here today. It is truly a pleasure, and it's also a privilege for me to be here virtually to take part in a world-class event with so many wonderful people who want to make a difference in the lives of those who have sickle cell. I only wish that we were here together in person so that I could meet with you and so that I could hear your stories. Since my journey began in helping to raise awareness of sickle cell disease in Canada, I've had the pleasure of attending many sickle cell awareness events in Canada. However, this is the first time that I've attended and been a part of an event outside of Canada. So thank you so much for that. Distinguished guests and delegates, in my remarks, I'll tell you the story of how I first became involved with the sickle cell disease community in Canada. I'll speak from my perspective and my experiences about how important relationship building between grassroots advocates and policymakers is to making good public policy. And it's about the vital role of grassroots community advocacy as well. As Ambassador Rosvito mentioned, I'm a senator and I represent the beautiful province of Nova Scotia on the Atlantic Ocean in Canada, and it's located on the ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq people. I've been a senator since the year 2000, but it wasn't until a breakfast event on October 29th, 2013, that my journey with sickle cell disease, with the sickle cell disease community in Canada began. Member of Parliament, Dr. Kirsty Duncan, along with the Sickle Cell Disease Association of Canada, hosted a meeting to introduce and inform Canadian parliamentarians about sickle cell disease. I'd heard of sickle cell disease before that, but I didn't really know a lot about the serious nature of the disease for Canadians. I learned later that many parliamentarians, both in the Senate and in the House of Commons, were unaware of the devastating effect that sickle cell disease can have on so many Canadians. At that meeting, I first met Lonray Tuji Ajayi, who was the president of the Canadian Association at the time. Attendees were given a briefing on the disease and the realities that Canadian families, and in particular children, face on a daily basis, coping with sickle cell disease and the challenges of the treatment. It was very moving for me to hear their stories. As a former school teacher of young children, I've always been concerned with the well-being of children. As a senator, I've had the opportunity to contribute to the national conversation on Canadian healthcare and children and youth mental health and well-being through work on extensive committees, studies, and reports. Following the briefing, when I was formally introduced to Lonray, I told her that I would be willing to help in any way that I could. Lonray accepted my offer, and almost immediately, we started working together in legislation to help raise awareness of sickle cell disease across Canada. Many of you had the opportunity to hear Lonray speak earlier today. She's an incredible person and a passionate advocate for those with sickle cell disease. As Lonray and I started working together, we had many discussions on the best way forward. In Canada, healthcare is primarily the jurisdiction of the governments of the Canadian provinces and territories. So Lonray and I had to determine what was the most appropriate measure that we could pursue on a federal level something that would draw attention and raise awareness of the disease with the Canadian public, while at the same time respecting the jurisdictions of the provinces and the territories. And sometimes that's a pretty tenuous balancing act to have. In the end, we decided that a good first step would be a bill calling on the Government of Canada to officially recognize July 19th of each year as National Sickle Cell Awareness Day. This date was chosen, as you would all know, because it falls in line with World Sickle Cell Day. Our first attempt at a Sickle Cell Awareness Day began in May of 2015. I introduced a Sickle Cell Awareness Day bill in the Senate, but a federal election was called shortly after that, and progress on the bill was stopped when Parliament dissolved for the election. When Parliament resumed after the election, I once again introduced the bill on December 8th, 2015. As the bill worked its way through the Canadian Parliament, I was so grateful to all of the senators and members of Parliament who spoke in support of our bill. I wasn't surprised with the support the bill received from my colleagues, but as I listened to the speeches delivered in Parliament, I was surprised by the number of MPs and senators who were directly affected on a personal level by this disease. In fact, I remember sitting in the House of Commons and watching the debate, and one of the MPs stood up to speak, and she told her colleagues that she carried the sickle cell trait. And I doubt that anybody in the House of Commons knew that before she stood up on that day. It took nearly 2.5 years, but on December 12th, 2017, the bill finally received royal assent and became law. Canada was one of the first nations in the world to officially recognize June 19th as their National Sickle Cell Awareness Day. We celebrated the first National Sickle Cell Awareness Day in Canada in June of 2018, and we're only a few weeks away from our third annual celebration. But as I mentioned earlier, recognizing June 19th is just the first step. At the time, one of the goals newborn screening for sickle cell disease across all jurisdictions in Canada. In 2013, only a few of the provinces and territories had newborn screening. Newborn screening is essential, as you would all know, not only to accurately diagnose early treatment, but also to inform those who may carry the sickle cell trait. Today, all but 3 provinces and territories have newborn screening for sickle cell disease. This screening provides early diagnosis, which means proper early treatment for these children. Distinguished delegates, I tell you all this to help highlight the importance that relationship building and focused grassroots advocacy play in influencing public policy. Meeting Lonray at that meeting and the resulting legislation to recognize June 19th in Canada as National Sickle Cell Awareness Day didn't just happen by chance. The Canadian Sickle Cell Association were focused. They knew what they were looking for when they organized that briefing on Parliament Hill in 2013. They were not only looking to educate parliamentarians, but they were hoping to find a champion, an ally within government to help continue the national conversation. Those of you who know Lonray know she is tenacious, she's dedicated, and she's definitely passionate. After our first meeting, we had many conversations. She knew exactly what she wanted. And I was able to provide advice on what was and wasn't possible in Parliament and what might be too much of a challenge as a first step. As I mentioned earlier, I was not and still am not an expert on sickle cell disease. And the Canadian Sickle Cell Association was able to use my experience as a parliamentarian to help them understand better the realities of legislative process. And of course, they were able to educate me as well. The exchange of knowledge was essential to accomplish our goals. I know it's a cliche, but advocacy, and particularly advocacy influencing public policy, is a marathon and not a sprint. And I'm sure you've heard those words before, because we all want things to happen immediately. But in my experience, setting achievable goals And reaching milestones along the way helps to keep disappointments and frustrations manageable in the long term. And it helps us all to avoid getting discouraged. It took us almost 2.5 years to pass our bill into law. We faced hurdles along the way, not to mention the sometimes slow legislative process and an election. But during that time, we kept the conversation going, both in Parliament and with the public, which is exactly what the bill was designed to do. It meant that Lonray and I also had the opportunity to speak about sickle cell disease at a televised Senate hearing in Canada, and that was certainly a positive thing. While I have the opportunity, I'd like to acknowledge and thank people who have been wonderful friends who advocate continuously on behalf of the sickle cell community in Canada, and particularly those young Canadians in treatment and their families. I can't talk about the conversation in Canada on sickle cell without mentioning former Member of Parliament and Minister of State for Multiculturalism and the Status of Women, Jean Augustine. She was the first person to ever speak about sickle cell in Parliament when she delivered a statement in the House of Commons on November 3rd in 1997. Jean told me that no one in Parliament at that time had even heard of sickle cell, including the health minister. I have to credit the amazing Jean Augustine for starting this conversation about sickle cell in Parliament. Darren Fisher, who's actually my member of Parliament from Nova Scotia, was the one who sponsored and ushered the sickle cell disease bill through the House of Commons. It's funny because usually when you have a private member's bill, you're phoning your colleagues on the House of Commons to ask if they will sponsor the bill. In this case, in one day, I had 5 phone calls from members of Parliament who asked if they could please sponsor my bill. Darren happened to be the first one to call, and he was my MP, so he brought the bill and guided it through the House of Commons. Biba Tinga is the current president of the National Sickle Cell Association. Biba and her team continue to do great work in Canada. Rugi Jala is the president of the Sickle Cell Association in my region of Nova Scotia and Atlantic Canada. Rugi introduced me to those in my community affected by the disease, which provided me with invaluable insight into the reality of those living with sickle cell in Nova Scotia. And by the way, Rugi and I, who hadn't known one another before this, discovered that we're neighbors and that we only live a few streets away from one another. So that was a very nice thing to learn. And lastly, I would like to thank my friend and past president, Lonray Tujia Jay. Without her, I would never have started on this journey. Lonray, Biba, and Rugi, I am very proud that these 3 strong women, all sickle cell warriors, distinguished delegates, the theme of this Congress is asking, what's next? During this period of history, I don't think there's a more relevant question to be asked as we find ourselves in the midst of a global pandemic. During my time involved with studies on the healthcare system and mental health services in Canada, the healthcare of Canadians has always been an issue near and dear to me. So many families deal every day with health concerns. We've all been faced with the challenges of COVID-19 for the last 1.5 years. Life has come to a standstill for so many. In Canada, we've been under various stay-at-home orders and lockdown restrictions across the country, unable to socialize or travel or visit family members. In many ways, life has been put on pause. For those living with sickle cell disease, can't be put on pause. It can't be put on hold. Treatment must continue, and supports for those living with sickle cell disease and their families have to continue. It's been a very difficult time for so many vulnerable people from every walk of life all over the world. As parliamentarians, as public office holders, as policymakers, our focus for the near future is going to be to transition out of the pandemic and into economic recovery. Parliamentarians have the ability, and I would argue the responsibility, to identify the gaps that exist in our healthcare and social services and enact legislative change to bridge those gaps. Colleagues, advocates will continue to play a vital role in identifying these gaps. It takes passionate, dedicated citizens to keep public office holders at all levels of government aware of the issues faced by people every day. We rely on community advocates like the Sickle Cell Disease Association of Canada and sickle cell disease associations around the world to help inform our policies. We must all be doers who take ideas and turn them into actions in order to affect change at the highest levels. Most great ideas start at the grassroots level by those who are most directly affected. People who want solutions, people like Lonry and Biba and Rugi, people like each of you. You are all advocates who work diligently to make change happen. It will be incumbent on politicians to ensure that our most vulnerable citizens are not left behind or forgotten as we move on from this pandemic. Thank you so much for the privilege of being a part of the Second African Congress on Sickle Cell Disease. It is together that we can make change happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Cordy. I think it's at this point that if we were to be a physical conference, people are going to be clapping at this point. I'm sure they are, but unfortunately, we can't hear them. Thank you very much for this presentation. It was really awesome and very insightful. I believe the African policymakers can also learn from what's going on in Canada as regards sickle cell. Thank you very much once again for coming on board. We look forward to having you again and again. So I would like to move on to the next session right now. Thank you, Senator Jane. We'll get talking. All right.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you very much.
All right.
Hopefully we'll get to meet in person.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
All right then.